Hello, Arle Perpetual Help. Good to be back with you again to speak to you about the Chronicles of Narnia, specifically the book, uh, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And if you forced me to tell which book is my favorite, this would probably be the one. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader it follows some of the four, Lucy and Edmund, um, and adds new characters. It has great adventure and great imagery, especially near the end. But it's the story of Caspian, now being king of Narnia. So it takes place a year or so after Prince Caspian. They Caspian has gone off on the Dawn Treader, which is his boat, to try and find the seven lords that left, that we hear about just in passing in Prince Caspian, the book, of the seven lords that Miraz encouraged to go out in the sea, so that Prince Caspian had no one to support him, so Miraz could take the throne. So after Caspian secures his throne and brings peace to Narnia, he vows to try and see what happens to these seven lords. And so Edmund, Lucy, and Eustace all come into the story as he's on his boat on his way. Edmund and Lucy were visiting their cousin Eustace, and in the beginning you sort of get this picture of Eustace being sort of not so nice a person. And not unlike Edmund, he has his conversion in this story, which is a very powerful moment. But they're in a room and they're looking at a picture which looks like a Narnian ship in the middle of a sea, and they get sucked into that picture to start the journey. And so, being Caspian's ship, he jumps off and saves them, brings them onto the ship, and then they're brought up to speed to what he's doing. So the first islands they visit on their journey. Also, we're reminded Reepicheep is on the ship as well, which is, from Prince Caspian and a great character. So his aspiration is to get to Aslan's country, which is presumably this way, based off of some rhymes and just their experience of Aslan always coming over the sea, and the emperor's, Aslan's father, the emperor, lands is this way, and so Reepicheep hopes to encounter the Aslan's country. And Farameth and Dorn are also two characters. They're the captain and the first mate, and so they play a part as well. But Prince Caspian and Lucy, Edmund, and Eustace play the biggest role, as well as Reepicheep. Reepicheep really is sort of like a very big and important character during this whole adventure. But they go to their first island, and they just want to walk around. It seems like a small island. It's the Lone Islands, which are technically Narnian owned islands. But they are, Narnia hasn't really been doing much in the way of naval things, and so they're not really sure whether or not they're still pledged to Narnia or not. Well, on their walk, Caspian, Lucy, Edmund, and Eustace all encounter Pug, and they're quickly captured, and Pug's revealed to be a slaver. A slavery being illegal in Narnian countries, they're like, okay, this is a problem. Anyway, so they're traveling to market. Pug's taking them to market, along with several other people that have been captured by Pug and his crew, and a man buys Caspian because he looks like Caspian the Ninth. This man being Byrne, one of the seven lords. And so working with Byrne and the captain of the Dawn Treader, they signal that to bring around the ships, which they don't have any other ships, to trick the Lone Isles, Grumpus, his sufficiency, who's the leader of the area, trick him to abdicate or let go of his power. And so Caspian charges into the castle and just acts like he owns the place, because technically he does. And, with Grumpus expecting or thinking that he has a bunch of other ships, he has to sort of allow Caspian to act as leader. And so they ask about slavery, and through sort of pressing the fact that, they shouldn't have slavery, and he's like, well, Grumpus says, well, we need slavery, and Caspian's like, yeah, no, we don't, and ends slavery and makes Byrne the Duke of the Lone Islands as opposed to Grumpus. So they found one of the lords and freed the slaves and got Eustace, Edmund, as well as Reepicheep and Lucy back. And so the first islands that they encounter is very successful. Shortly after they leave the Lone Islands, Eustace sort of takes over as narrating, as it follows his journal or diary, which shows Eustace and sort of his negativity about the whole situation. We get a little taste of that before, but the diary adds to that as well. So they run into a big storm. Two of the water caskets break, and so they're on water rationing. Also, Eustace encounters Reepicheep and does not have a very... He swings him around by his tail, and Reepicheep beats him because Reepicheep's a knight and he's not to be trifled with. So Eustace, sort of continues to be a nuisance, and so when everyone's feeling poorly because they're on water rations and not drinking very much, and Eustace tries to steal some water at night. Of course, it's in his diary and his perspective, so he's putting it out that he's the one that's in the right. But anyway, so Reepicheep catches him in it and then says anyone who gets caught doing this will get 20 lashes. But eventually they find the next island, and this is very important for Eustace because so the ship is in poor disarray right now. The mast broke, and so they have to repair the water barrels and refill the water barrels and everything else. Well, Eustace doesn't like the idea of having to work after being in such poor condition for such a while with the lack of water and whatever, and so he trudges off and hides and plans on taking a rest. But then he realizes that, maybe they've left him or they're going to leave him. So then he tries to get back, and there's a mist that comes on. He ends up going the wrong way, ends up in a valley, and then he sees a dragon. Not necessarily, he doesn't know what a dragon is. As C.S. Lewis puts it, he's read all the wrong books to know what a dragon is. But the dragon's old and actually dies right there. And then it starts to rain. And so he looks to find shelter, and the only shelter is the dragon's cave. So he goes into the dragon's cave and, of course, finds a stash of gold and treasure. And Eustace recognizes how he could probably live like a king here in Narnia, because he doesn't recognize how to get back. So he stuffs his pockets and puts on an armband with all kinds of treasure, and then falls asleep. And he wakes up with a pain in his arm. And lo and behold, Eustace has become a dragon. And this is... so there's a whole scene where he is just realizing he is a dragon. He thinks he's sleeping next to a dragon because he sees the claws and the fire and everything, seeing his own claws and his own smoke coming from his nostrils. But once he figures out he's the dragon, he tries to go back to tell the rest what has happened, and eventually gets that conveyed through Lucy's ability to love all creatures and see sort of the dragons not out to hurt them. And so Eustace they recognize that it is Eustace, but then, like, Eustace starts to recognize how much he misses human contact, not being able to speak as a dragon and having dragon appetites. He's able to help the party much more than he ever helped before. Like, he gets goats for them, and he actually pulls out a pine tree to set up as a new mast. But the problem is, Eustace is huge, and he eats a lot, and they're looking to go to another island, and they don't really know what to do. Well, thankfully, Aslan acts, and Aslan encounters him, and we hear what happens through Eustace telling Edmund. So he comes back to camp and as a boy and talks to Edmund and tells him what happens. And so the encounter with Aslan as a dragon, Aslan, even not knowing who Aslan is, of course, either way, follows Aslan, and Aslan takes him to a well or a lake and tells him to disrobe before going in. And so Eustace is like, okay, I'll try and take off my skin. And he does. He actually takes off his skin. But then he finds he's got more scales underneath. And he does this a couple times, and it just doesn't work. And then Aslan says, you have to do a dress again, but let me help. And so Aslan cuts deep, and then he's able to shed the dragon's skin. And he bathes and then is dressed by Aslan. But, as Aslan's way, he doesn't actually talk, but he does speak to Aslan. He does speak to Eustace. It's the best sort of explanation of confession, the recognition that we need help to shed these sins. It's not possible for us to do it on our own. We need God's grace, Jesus's help. And so he rejoins, and everybody's joyful, and then they head further in. And they call it Dragon Island, because there was a dragon on it, because Eustace turned into a dragon. And they find that the bracelet that Eustace was wearing was one of the lords, so they presume that the lord had perished there as well. That's 2 lords found. Then they encounter a sea serpent, and we see Eustace act in a way that he has not acted before. Not that it was super helpful, but he does realize that he's a part of the group now and wants to be a part of the group. And then, but it's actually Reepicheep who figures out the serpent's trying to crush the ship, and so they're all trying to push the serpent off the ship so that it doesn't crush it to splinters, and they succeed. And thankfully, the serpent's pretty stupid and gets caught up in the expectation of being able to eat, the presumably crushed ship. So they get past the sea serpent, and they move on to the next island, which they find a lake, but thankfully they don't touch it. But they see sort of like a big statue at the bottom of the lake, and after they try and touch it with a spear, and the spear becomes heavy and looks like the same material as the statue as well. And Edmund's shoe touches the water, and it turns gold. And they recognize that whatever the water touches turns to gold. They also realize that at the bottom of the lake is one of the three lords, one of the seven lords, the third lord that they found. And so they encounter this water that turns things to gold, and there's this dangerous moment where greed sort of takes over. Aslan steps in again. We just hears Lucy cries that they stop, and then Aslan appears for a moment, and everyone realizes that they're getting caught up in this human greed, and they're able to get away from it. And then they call it Deathwater Island, because anything that touches the water dies. Also turns to gold. But yeah. Then next they encounter the island of invisible creatures. So they get in to this island, and they're going out and looking, and Lucy gets a rock stuck in her shoe and stops to take it out, and hears voices, and she can't figure out where the voices are coming from. But they said they're going to stop them before they go back to the ship. So Lucy goes to tell the rest of the party, and then they're surrounded by these 50 or so voices. And these voices call themselves Duffers. And the Duffers threaten them and say, if you don't help us, we'll kill you. And so Reepicheep is sort of a big component of this as well. And they're like, okay, well, what do you need? And they need Lucy to go up and read this magician's book to try and make them visible again, because they've been invisible for a while because they think they've been uglified, and they need a girl to read it, and they're not willing to do it themselves. So the next girl they saw, they wanted to force to go up. And so Lucy says, I'll do it, and they sort of turn to Reepicheep, and Reepicheep's like, well, that's fine, it's not against her honor, it's not like we can help her, we probably would die if we tried to fight these invisible creatures, and it's not against her honor, and it's her selfless act to go up to this magician's book and say the spell to free these creatures from their invisibility. And so they do. Lucy does. And so they go to bed. They actually have a nice dinner. The invisible creatures provide dinner for them. But they're interesting because it looks like they're hopping and thumping, which will be explained once we see what they are. But the whole scene with Lucy reading the magician's book is very interesting. She's tempted by a spell of beauty, and Aslan sort of helps her get over that. But then she does a eavesdropping spell where she hears her friend saying something that she didn't actually mean, but she was just doing it because she was weak. And so Aslan is a big... Aslan is always a big aspect of these stories, but in this scene specifically, we get a lot of Aslan's acting to save Lucy and the whole crew. And so then she finally finds the invisible spell and makes invisible things visible, which not only makes the invisible creatures visible, but makes Aslan visible, who's right nearby. And we get, again, Aslan sort of saying, yeah, of course I'm going to follow my own rules, the rules in which creation is. So Aslan becomes visible because he's there always by our side, and the spell that makes invisible things visible makes him visible. And Lucy gets to speak to him and the magician, and learns a little bit more about what's going on there. But the magician is the person who is leading these monopods. And they only have 1 foot, and that's why they're jumping all about. That's the thumping that they hear, and why they just jump back and forth. And he's trying to help them, guide them, but he's seen, as a not that the monopods don't really like him too much. But anyway, so when Lucy encounters them, she calls them monopods, but then they mix duffers with monopods and call themselves dufflepods or pods. And so it's an interesting thing for sure. But the dufflepods are fairly nice creatures. They're just a little dumb, and they agree with each other. They always agree with the leader, and then when Lucy's trying to tell them they look good, as opposed to uglified like they presumed because the leader said so, they agree with both positions, both Lucy that says they look good now and that they don't look good based off the other Dufflepods' encouragement. So interesting things, but the most interesting thing is the magician, which we learn about a little bit later. So the next island they encounter is the Dark Island. They also encounter their fourth lord. The fourth lord is actually in this Dark Island, and they are about to enter in, and Reepicheep calls them out. They don't want to enter in because it's a dark island, and it's scary, and nobody wants to say, well, they don't really want. But Reepicheep says, look, we can't let fear guide us. And so they enter into this darkness. And a person screams, and they find the Lord in the blackness. And the blackness is explained once the Lord's drawn up, and he says, our dreams are made real here. And so, people are like, oh, doesn't sound that bad. Like they're thinking about daydreams, things that are good, things that you want. But then the reality is, dreams, we often don't necessarily have control of. It's subconscious. And so there's a lot of fear in that. And this Lord has been stuck here for presumably many years. And so he just needs to get out. And then the rest of the crew recognize how much they need to get out as well. And so they're trying to get out, and there's a lot of fear. And Lucy prays to Aslan, and Aslan leads them out through the leading of an albatross. And then they find out that this person is the fourth Lord, Lord Roop. And so they continue on and find one of the last islands, the last island before they hit Aslan's country, Ramadan's island, or Ramam, I don't know how to say his name, but Ramamul's island. And so they encounter this island, and they go in, and they find a table with a bunch of food on it. And they also find 3 lords asleep at the table. And so they presume that, maybe whoever ate the food would be put to sleep. And so they weren't going to eat the food, and they maybe go back to their ship. They found their last 3 lords, all 7 in total. But it is Reepicheep who says, well, I'm going to sit at the table. I don't think we should eat the food, but I'm going to sit at the table because I want to experience whatever is happening here, because there's obvious magic here and obvious amazing things going on. And so Edmund, Lucy, Caspian, and Eustace all sit at the table as well. And eventually, just before sunrise, a door opens and a woman steps forward and approaches the table and says, why haven't you eaten any of the food? And so they say, well, we think that the food might be enchanted to allow, to put these 3 lords to sleep. And then the woman points the stone knife on the table, which is the same stone knife from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so it was actually when they touched the stone knife about to get into a fight they were put to sleep, because nobody should touch that stone knife, as it was the implement that killed Aslan on the stone table. And so they say, the food is Aslan's table. It's set before for anyone who makes it this far, because this is the end of, or the beginning of Aslan's country, more or less. And so the food is going to be replenished every day. And so they then see that happen. But first, they say, please eat the food. And Edmund actually says, well, how can we tell if we can trust you? And it's Reepicheep again who says, well, pour me some of that wine. I'll try it. And so he tries it, trusting the lady. And the food is good. And so they have this great feast. And then they see the dawn come in. And it's the most beautiful thing they see, because they're on the water. It's right before Aslan's country, so things are different here. And so a bunch of birds come, and they eat everything on the table, and remove all the bones. And an old man comes out to meet, when you find out that the old man's, the daughter is the old man's, the woman is the daughter of the old man. And so they sing as the new day comes in. And the rest of the crew comes out, and the old man offers to give the Lord Roop rest as well. So he's put to sleep at the table as well, as the rest of the crew moves on into Aslan's country. But that whole scene is just a beautiful scene. But you find out that the man, the old man, and then also the magician were both stars. And I think it's neat that I think it's Eustace that says, "Oh, stars are just balls of gas in our world," and the man says that's not what stars are. That's what stars are made of, right? So just because it has a physical presence that we recognize in science doesn't mean that there's not a deeper reality. And so that whole aspect is very cool. So they all move on into Aslan's country. And so things get very interesting from this point on. And so Lucy sees an underwater world as they get closer and closer. And one of the underwater people who look like lords themselves sort of challenge. And of course Reepicheep sees the challenge, and he jumps in the water and wants to fight, but then he drinks the water, and the water is sweet. And so Reepicheep's brought back up, and they find out the water is sweet, which is part of the rhyme that Reepicheep recites at the beginning, and that says that they're now in Aslan's country. And they all drink some of the wine, or the water, which is stronger than wine, it says. Says it's liquid light is what the water is. Definitely an interesting concept. But it gives them strength. It's more sustaining than any food or water. It also heightens their senses and gives them life. Very much sort of maybe an allusion to, as Catholics, the Eucharist. A taste, a foretaste of what God has provided for, or wants to give us in our heavenly home. And that heavenly reality is given to us in the form of the Eucharist, or in their situation, this water. So they get closer and closer and closer, and they don't sleep, or they don't need food, and the sun gets brighter, and they get closer until they find they get to a point where the ocean has come up to a point where they can stop, where the boat can't go any further. And so they all pull over, and pull over, or they get out of the current, which is moving towards Aslan's country. Also, you find out that their world is flat, like a big round dish, and so Reepicheep sort of has this great moment where he says, I always imagined it, the water's rushing over the side, and then, when we get there, the ship will tip up, and we'll look down, and then down, down, down. And he's just like, okay, Reepicheep, you're a little crazy, but what an awesome image. And he's like, well, whatever happens, like, you just get a real sense of Reepicheep's character in this. And so Caspian then decides that he wants to go to Aslan's country, where he's not supposed to. Part of waking the 3 other lords, someone needs to be sent to Aslan's country, which Reepicheep had planned to from the beginning. But Caspian decides that he's going to abdicate his throne, which is not what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to go back. And so Reepicheep calls him out on it, and does the rest of the crew, says, you're obligated to go back. You're not a free man. You can't choose just to do what you want to do. And Caspian, being king, says, I thought you're all my subjects. And they say, we are, and to serve you best, we'll do whatever is necessary to keep you from making this terrible choice. And so it's actually Lucy that says, and you more or less promised that you would return to the island to meet or talk to, maybe marry the star's daughter. And so that breaks him out of it. And he says, okay, we're all turning around and going back home. And Reepicheep says, well, not all of us. And he says he has like a little fit at this moment. And Reepicheep says, you can't let me, you have to let me go. Anyway, so Caspian then goes down, slams the door, and goes to his cabin. And then they come encounter him later, and Aslan's spoken to him and says, look, this is what you have to do. And he listens. And so Caspian and the crew all go back, and Edmund, Lucy, Eustace, and Reepicheep all move on further. And so they go a little bit further until they can't run any further, and they encounter this great wave that's sort of coming up above them. And Aslan's not here. This is from the movie, which is a little bit different scene. But Reepicheep comes up in his little boat and goes over, and they say goodbye to him, and he goes over into Aslan's country, which is a cool scene unto itself. And then Lucy, Edmund, and Eustace go off their own way, and they find a little patch of land, and they see a lamb, and the lamb offers them food, and they have fish on the sea, or right on this land right before the sea, and the lamb becomes Aslan, the lion and the lamb from Revelations, the recognition, the sacrificial lamb, who's also the Lion of Judah, God. And so then Aslan allows them to go back to their own country, goes back to their place in England, and Eustace is changed forever because he's encountered the Lord. But I think the coolest thing about this scene is Lucy and Edmund are told they're not going to be able to come back to Narnia. And Lucy says, it's not that, the land, we don't care about coming back here, it's you that we want to see. And Aslan says, yes, and that's why you came here, to come to know me, but not forever, so that you could come back to your own world and know me from there. He says, there is a way to my country from everywhere. This isn't your way, not from Narnia, but there's a way to my country from every world. And you have to go back to your world to know me in your own world so that you can get there from our world. So that recognition again, obviously Aslan is Jesus. In our world, is same person, same God. And so that reality is revealed to them. Anyway, so I look forward to speaking to you on Friday on all the parts that you enjoyed, all the aspects of this story, to share with each other the great witness C.S. Lewis gave us in the Narnia series. God bless you, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.